Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. It's easily the most destructive river flood in United States history. Obviously, on a national disaster standpoint, that's something that's very important to our history, with other things like Hurricane Katrina and some other things that have happened. But from a river standpoint, certainly the most dangerous of all time. It affected multiple states, but most importantly, the three main ones were the Mississippi Delta area, including Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. So from right here, our geographical representation of that flood is right there. So I'll be talking about a few things today. Obviously, one that's very important is just the destruction from a statistical standpoint, how damaging it really was, but some other things in the backdrop were environmental tactics taken for this event, as well as the backdrop of African-American relations during the time period. So I'll talk about a few things just involved with that. So the first thing discussed was I talked about is environmental tactics and management during this river flood. So initially during that time period, before anything like this had happened, environmentalists took a levees-only tactic approach to this, which basically was a refusal to use any sort of reservoir system to dilute water and move water away from riverbeds and river flow. Obviously nowadays there's thousands and thousands of reservoirs used all across the country to move water out during this time. Flooding comes into play. But during that time period, there was no reservoir systems at all. The thought was that river flows and the currents would move sediment through the rivers to deepen it to the point where flooding would never occur. Obviously, with something like this that was so damaging, that never occurred, and they failed in that regard. So as they moved forward, they changed their ideas on all of that and started to use a reservoir system the way we do today. So this had a very major turning point for environmental tactics and management of river flooding. That was a reference by John Berry in his book. He was the main contributor to knowledge of this discussion and topic. The second really important factor of this event was the backdrop of African-American relations. So during this time period, of course, before any sort of civil rights activism was taken, during the 1950s, during the 1920s, the relations between African-Americans and whites was still very poor. So, although there was a very high budget surplus during that time period, African Americans still were living in horrible conditions, and this event only exacerbated the destruction and the horrible living conditions they were living in. They were living in muds, or tents covered in mud, in proximity to the flooding, much closer than any white people were living in. They were living in much worse conditions. Another portion of that is that African Americans were violently forced to attempt to subdue flooding and damaging during that time period. Obviously, it was kind of a lost cause with the amount of flooding at that rate. There was no point in even trying to do that kind of thing, but African Americans were the lowest on the totem pole, unfortunately, and they were used to try to sandbag the waters, try to curb the destruction. But obviously, like I said, it was a lost cause, and a lot of lives were lost during that time period to try and stop that. They were held at gunpoint, some even killed for trying to say no. So it was a lose-lose situation for many African Americans during the time period. And then the last thing I wanted to discuss was just the statistical backdrop and the way it worked. The numbers were astonishing in that nearly 1 million people were moved away from their homes. Now, during the time period, the population wasn't as great as it is now. So adjusted to inflation, the numbers would be much higher, but almost 1 million people were pushed away from their homes due to flooding. And the mileage that it covered, so at the time it was 16.5 million acres of land were destroyed, covering nearly 26,000 miles of the United States, and like I said, specifically in that Delta area. And then from a monetary standpoint, adjusted to inflation, nearly $400 million were used to subdue the damages during that time period. It affected nearly 92,000 businesses, and 165,000 homes were destroyed during the time period. So in conclusion, as I wrap things up, we'll talk about just what I said again. The flood, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, is the most destructive natural river flood in the United States history. Once again, that's a lot to wrap your head around, but from a natural disaster standpoint, and as over 100 years have passed, you see, or not 100, excuse me, 90 or so, you see that it has not been passed ever from a destruction standpoint. But it also helped us learn how to adjust to flooding and the installation of reservoir systems. It was a major turning point for the United States. I felt like this topic was extremely important and that many people don't know about it. I wanted to learn about it. I wanted to teach others about it. And as something that was so important during the 20th century in terms of a damaging moment, it's important that we learn about it. And I also thought it was interesting in that its relation to African American relations at the time